Hi there, and welcome to this Mad Sense video in which I kind of talk a bit more about the what the bleep questions and answers about the experience of hearing voices. I'm going to focus a little bit, 2 slides really, on the on our reward systems, and of course, and I'm going to bracket that with a summary actually from the experience videos part 1 and 2. And over here on outcomes from the videos summaries part 2 and part 3. So in a sense, it's also a bit of a summary of where we're at so far. So first of all, the bit on experience, I'm going to actually sort of focus that on kind of showing you how it creates fear and paranoia. And this is because it's obviously the primary cost of care and the need for support. It's the biggest knock on quality of life, not only of the people who actually hear voices and experience extreme states, but also family and friends roundabout. I mentioned in the previous video, that actually what matters in our natural reward profile is this combination of the quality of the signals that we're getting and the progression of them. So I'm going to just summarize that in a slightly broader context in this particular video. I'll use the same chart to kind of show how that changes when we hear voices, and I'll use this one to actually highlight how it is that the experience of voices is able to actually create emotional sensitivities to particular themes. As I've mentioned beforehand, I developed sensitivities, to a couple of themes, and it was primarily because it's where voices were actually busy, and of course I struggled to reach an outcome. And of course, what that's doing is it's just locking you in your mind and pestering you with the same idea. And because we don't actually, find an outcome or find an alternative reward path, we get stuck, in the mind, and of course that's how our sensitivity develops to those themes. And then one very quick slide at the end just to kind of point out that actually it's the phenomenon that we need to be addressing. You'll find that one looks quite familiar by this stage. So first of all, a couple of slides, I'm just picking out 3 slides actually from the experience mapping videos part 1 and part 2. In part 1, I showed that actually the key factors that shape the experience of hearing voices really for all of us are one, that we actually have a processor. Our processing is predictive. So when it's engaged, it's inclined to follow that sort of process. That when we hear voices, we receive these unusual stimuli. They are inserted in the aware mind, independent of the context that we're in. Over time, the brain is trained to recognize them and become, or recognize this source as unsafe, if you like, and becomes hyper aware. We notice and hypervigilant. We notice the presence and absence. Of course, absence here translates to fear that it will come back again. Invasiveness, which is the power with which it engages our processor or our threat systems. Variety, which is just a way of getting our attention. Those 3 work together to prepare the mind to receive content. Content is inserted in one of many sensory modes, and I spoke about thought intrusion, about voices talking to each other, that I could hear, so something in the distance, which is a one-way thing, or this 2-way thing, which is the dominant mode for most people who hear voices, is that actually it's this idea of a thought echo, or at least where my thoughts and what voices say are exchanged in the same bandwidth. And what this what voices do is they use this unusual experience of the phenomenology itself, because we're experiencing this now as something other. And of course, they're commenting on what we're doing, no matter where we are. They literally are saying, I can see you, I can follow you. They create this idea of having this vantage point, of course, from which they can actually see everything. And of course, they try and escalate that idea of being all seeing to being all knowing, and then of course to being omnipotent. And you can see that in one of the beliefs videos. So from that, voices then are able to lead us towards particular interpretations, because of course we're finding interpretations for this weird thing. So of course we're in the space where we cannot prove nor disprove anything, and of course in that situation voices are able to assert absolutely anything, and they can mimic anyone, anybody. They can pretend to be this, they can pretend to be that, they can pretend to be this and that, they can pretend to be this and that, even if this and that are in conflict with each other, because actually they really don't care. All they're doing is asserting what they are, because in the moment they can make it scary, and that's the experience of it. And of course I also spoke about how some of our beliefs and interpretations of this are actually derived in the community. Throughout our history, some of our historical ones have persevered quite remarkably. And of course, that's of course because, well, the most obvious example is, way back when, a couple of thousand years ago, a voice claimed to be God in a culture that believed in gods. And of course, the people that heard them at that stage actually believed them. Anyway, so we have some persistent sort of cultural beliefs, if you like, that actually, of course, shape this experience. And of course, for an individual hearer, those cultural beliefs are very much likely to shape the experience, because the beliefs of others pretty much get imposed on you. And of course, the outcome of all of this in the mind is that actually what happens is we form new relationships. One is a relationship with the mind or with oneself, because voices are pestering me about who I am, and because I'm experiencing these strange things arriving in my mind. Of course, my mind and self become objects that I examine. And of course, because voices are continually provoking me, I get this new relationship with myself. My thoughts have very much come into focus. There's an interaction between my thoughts and this phenomenon that sets up an actual relationship that actually has the same signal strengths as an actual relationship with a real live person. And in this case, they're mostly abusive, so they have very, very powerful emotions associated with them. And of course, the other relationship is between the hearer and voices, and whatever voice it is, whether you interpreted it, or whether voices have asserted it, or whether voices have suggested it or deceived you into believing it. All of those beliefs about what it is or what it might be serve to actually intensify experience. In part 2, I kind of pointed out that actually, given the structure, voices are able to create many contexts and stories, all of which have these same kinds of characteristics, the primary one being that they push us into the space where we can neither prove nor disprove anything. They exaggerate that problem and make it either sort of unapproachable or impossible to solve. And that's what is common to all of those kinds of stories, is that voices are in this position of inserting conflict, and they do this, I say, in many, many ways. Some of them very obvious, conflict between good and evil, or God and the devil, and then of course, God became an evil God in sort of my case. So even then one character, of course, who decided he needed both these ideas, both good and evil, which of course is just a way of introducing conflict to the hearer. Of course, then they escalate the significance, they set the whole thing. Whilst I was trying to understand, they engaged what was going on. Voices engaged me in the middle of this battle between good and evil in this sort of other world, which of course they tried to impose on this world. So that's what I mean by escalating the significance. And of course, the experience of it becomes assessing the implications. And of course, we don't have the information that will get us out of that situation, because we're in this space where nothing can be proved nor disproved. And of course, voices make a big song and dance about the information, and there's either shared, not shared, secret, blah, blah, blah. Of course, they engage you very personally, so they make it personal. You're either part of the solution or the problem, typically both, because then they can encourage you and discourage you. And of course, what happens through this process is, simply because I'm hearing voices, which leads to these extreme states, my credibility is damaged in the eyes of those around me. So of course, getting help actually is, number one, is very, very difficult. Number two, actually describing, of course, what is going on becomes very, very difficult, because we get stuck in this subjective experience of it, because voices have managed to set this catch-22 trap, that traps the mind in this situation where they can keep provoking, And what's happening is it's sparking all these associations, we're assessing the implications, and of course that's what's leading to the extreme states. And of course, while that's happening, voices aggravate it and, and pounce on it, and engage via these sort of promises and threats. Most promises, by the way, are expressed as threats. And of course, what they're doing is they're shunting thinking towards particular frames of reference, which of course suit voices rather than us. And of course, in terms of outcomes, they claim the good as being due to them, or they blame the individual for the bad. And of course, what's happening is our brain, literally our brain, is being modified. We become hypervigilant. We've got all these beliefs, if you like, or suspicions by suggestion and by the actual experience of voices being aggressive and abusive. So I experience voices as aggressive and abusive. I must, of course, they're appearing in my aware mind. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm very logically going to ask the question: what are the implications of this in the world that I live in? How can they, what influences do they have on the people around me, and what's happening around me? And of course, as I ask those questions, as I'm shunted into these frames of reference in my story, voices are inserting all of this kind of stuff. And that's the stuff that we're talking about and that we're expressing, because the flip side of that is that actually what this is doing is undermining my sense of security, my sense of confidence, my sense that I can actually achieve the outcomes that I want. So that's what I'm saying, that it entirely affects what we do. It sort of narrows the scope of activities that we get involved in. We form these limiting beliefs. And of course, it leads to all this wasteful activity, because just like the problem of my neighbor spying on me was a completely fake problem, the problem of God and the devil is a completely fake problem. And of course, the idea of conspiracy, from the experience of it, is neither here nor there. It's entirely independent of whether or not there actually is any conspiracy. Voices will simply use what's in the news to amplify the intensity of these stories. And I say, having set up the structure with phenomenology that kind of leads to the brain adjusting to make it more ready to receive the inputs via these different kinds of modes, with all these special effects, voices create these stories through which they are asserting power relationships. Number one, they're setting these catch-22 contexts, and of course what this does is it gives them this kind of situation from which they can claim to be anything from ancestors to God, the devil, to aliens, to good aliens, to bad aliens, to multiples, to part of another dimension, to forcing a belief in reincarnation on you, to threatening to punish you in the life hereafter for eternity, threatening to make this world hell. All of those kinds of things are done from this vantage point, as I say, which is all seeing. I'm pretty sure that voices can actually see a lot of what's going on. But of course, they try and parlay that into being omnipotent. And of course, what that does is it gives them a position from which to engage your emotional systems, make sure that actually all of them are not achieving outcomes that would actually satisfy them. That holds our attention, and we get engaged in this relationship with voices, which is usually an abusive one. And I also pointed out actually that there is a way to simply dismiss all of this, reject it completely, name voices, give them silly names, and actually treat them like 2-year-old kids, because pretty much make them pathetic instead of evil. But of course, what this does is it's given voices a structural situation in which they can impose literally everlasting conflict. I think this seems to be what they have set out to do. And from that position, they can hurl abuse at us, make threats, and promises. And of course, those are intensified by the beliefs that they lead us towards and the doubts and uncertainty that they create by their very nature. And of course, they're actually able to distort our perception by inserting, information, a vision, somatic sensation at a particular time. And they do that in particular to exaggerate their power. So if they can actually punish me physically, which they can, okay, then again, I'm going to ask the question, what influence do they have on someone around me? And actually the short answer to dealing with that, by the way, is that people won't act outside their values except under extreme duress. So perhaps under an extreme state, if you corner me, for example, I'm going to fight back because I'm feeling cornered. But it doesn't make me dangerous. That makes you stupid, quite frankly. So what I'm getting at here is actually people in general don't act outside their values. So my voices have told me to do all sorts of awful things, and of course you don't, because you won't act outside your values. So there's no reason why anyone around you will act outside their values either. So if voices are telling me to do stuff and I'm not, then the influence that they have on others around me is likely to be minimal. At worst, and in fact, I think we can actually rely on people around us to act with at least within within their values. It may not always be respectful, but they're unlikely to actually harm us. Yet that's the perception that we get of the world because of this busyness, within this kind of structure that traps you in the mind. And of course, with these things in place, power relationship, situation I can't get out of, a position from which voices can literally hold me in an extreme state for rather long periods of time. That's what creates fear. And of course, worrying about those situations happening again, or voices actually imposing some of the consequences that they can, is what leads to paranoia. So it's this expectation of harm and of being scared again. And of course, that's what makes it scary. Literally, all three of our emotional systems feel threatened because they're not achieving what we would ordinarily be achieving. We don't have info to get ourselves out of this situation, for example. And it becomes confusing because what we end up living with is these beliefs and interpretations and an assessment of the implications of what this means, and none of which beliefs actually intensify the experience. Interpretations become the experience, and of course, so do implications, because the implications are usually unpleasant, and of course, they're creating the paranoia. So, the beliefs are intensifying, the interpretations actually are the experience. So when I say voices lock you in this space, it's actually when you're assessing the implications of an interpretation that you've reached based on something voices have actually said to you, which is calling up a bunch of associations. You don't have the time to figure out what's real or what's not real. Voices are peppering you literally at every thought. You're in a state of fear. To expect anybody to be reasonable and actually think through what this really means at that point just is unreasonable. We've got to work to prevent people getting there, number one. And number two, we've got to actually make sure that people have a practiced response. So, for example, I use the name, just a single word. That's my practiced response. It's available anytime. And then, of course, you'll see in the mind strategies, I offer people ways to think about having an emergency plan. So that if you get into this kind of stage, that information is actually in the brain and is therefore accessible in kind of states of fear. So the other piece of the confusion is to say that others impose their beliefs on you. I've already mentioned that, because you're confused and seem irrational and seem incapable of looking after yourself at this point. The beliefs and wishes of others get imposed on you, not very pleasant at all. And then, of course, what that does is it complicates your life. And it complicates because I've left blank, because for each individual, of course, and each individual's particular setting and who's around them, all those things will, of course, complicate their lives in ways that are actually unique to their context. So, of course, what's happening with all of this is it's provoking the mind. It's producing all these transactions with high levels of fear and paranoia. And of course, this stuff is wiring the brain. So let's just look at how the brain is ordinarily being wired. Of course, because what's happening here is simply that we're receiving unusual stimuli which provoke us in particular ways. So what's the sort of natural flow? And then we'll look at at what happens when voices get in the way. I wrestled with what title to use for this slide. And in the end, what I decided on was this idea that actually ordinarily, we live in community, not in our minds. And that's because I'm doing this because the experience of hearing voices is very much in the mind, because we now have these transactions which mimic real life transactions that make it an actual experience from a reward progression point of view. So that even though, ordinarily, when we're sort of moving through our day, we experience our day in the mind. We don't live in our mind, if you know what I mean. Our mind is actually just generally, as I say, reacting and responding. It's become, most of the time, the stuff that our mind is doing has become so routine and so practiced that actually this flow is working pretty routinely, pretty much all day. It's not often that we get a stimulus that produces a strong enough reaction that we actually interrupt the process or stop it and slow it down or reverse it and actually go and say, I don't accept that. Let's go back and actually, go back and check and say, is this, what actually, does this stimulus actually make sense? Did I, have I heard the right thing? Is that what you said? Is that what I expected? We don't often go back, push the process backwards. So what normally happens, for all of us is that actually, we receive stimuli in the habitats that we choose. So this is what I'm representing simply by this rectangle with these circles. These are the habitats that I circulate in, if you like. And of course, they're part of society, which is what I'm, and of course, I'm just using these 4 little versions of my logo to represent, kind of society, if you like, or community. So this is what sort of sets the expectations. So in my habitat, so for example, on the train, on the way to work, people in general, even though I don't know them, behave in particular ways. I mean, they generally, well, there's this mix of, some that will be sort of quite accommodating in helping you get on a busy subway, for example. Sometimes people are quite, inconsiderate and of course don't move to the middle of the car, and that can sort of be very frustrating, but you sort of understand it, what have you. So, of course you develop those sort of patterns, but your expectation is developed in this sort of case on routine and how people sort of generally behave. So, the kind of stimuli or the reaction that they produce, your stimuli arrive from the environment or habitat that you've chosen. Your brain is literally scraping off the ones that are relevant to you. And of course, generally, we have, as I say, this filter. We can actually normally say, okay, let's go. I'm going to process it as is. I'm going to query it, or no, I'm going to reject it. I don't accept that. We could normally say. So we have this option, if you like, of a proactive and deliberate filter. Normally the way it engages our emotional systems is in a not particularly strong way. It's because we're actually finding pretty much what we would expect. And so what our emotional systems are doing are simply ticking the boxes, and I might sort of come home at the end of the day and just say, oh, I bumped into so-and-so today. That was nice. Or gee, I had a great meeting today. It went better than I expected. But we're not engaging extreme emotions typically during the day, unless something really surprising happens, or occasionally something frightening, but almost never anything frightening. We seldom engage our threat system. Our soothe system might be a bit unhappy if we don't get what we want, for example. A meeting didn't go as well as I anticipated. So now I have to do more work and what have you. So I'm having to invest more time to reach an outcome that I was achieving. That might be kind of the worst thing that sort of happens to us in an ordinary day, and that's kind of okay because it's statistically ordinary. And of course, what this does is whatever stimulus arrives, we can actually think about it, under in a state of mind that is usually pretty calm and balanced. And of course, we can achieve the outcomes that we want. So both outcomes in the mind, sort of answers or understanding of what I want to do, understanding, or an assessment of the implications. There'll be many options, and of course from those we'll choose some and actually go out and express them. We'll talk about some of them. We'll actually go and do some of them. And I just use my logo to represent this. So the outside circle is representing that we feel secure. The heart, of course, and body are representing that I feel good about what I'm doing. And my little arc is shining with joy, basically. So this is the representing love, loving life, laughing out loud. And of course, this is the most fun when we're actually sharing it with other people, either with someone, a special relationship, or close friends, and of course people that we work with, etc. But we normally have a fairly sort of small, sort of circle, of people, and of course this is where we're getting, all, of course, of our reward. And of course, I mentioned that what we could do is we could measure this in terms of quality and progression. So quality is a signal, and the combination of these is what creates our perception of what's going on. But of course, we project that forwards, which gives us our picture of the world. and I'm representing perception with this thing. It's this icon. It's this combination of the information that we kind of select, how we feel about it, which shapes, of course, what we see. So it's a sort of combination of believing is seeing and seeing is believing, because that's actually how this process, by using a model of perception, actually works. It's this, if there's a very logical flow, so literally kind of logic, it'll very clearly flow from this end to this end. If we're confronted with a situation where we actually don't know what the answer actually is, and we need to make a decision, or we form a belief and we make a decision on that, and our belief is typically in that case based on the kind of outcome that we actually want to create. Of course, a lot of our other beliefs are things that we learn, during our life, and of course, cultural beliefs are simply beliefs that we learn as well. We just learn them, of course, from others and from the culture, as opposed to just from discovering. But of course, they all, of course, affect our perception. Some good examples, for example, so if you're perhaps devoutly religious, and in some religions that don't believe in premarital sex, for example, that's a belief. So what that leads to is, if you encounter a young woman who's having sex, for example, before she's married, you're quite liable to disapprove. What you need to recognize is that disapproval is based entirely on your belief. It has nothing to do with reality. And of course, you're experiencing that emotion based on your belief. As I say, normally what you're getting in that particular case is you're getting approval from the community that you're in, which kind of balances that one out for you. And I'm simply saying, those two are actually entirely belief-based experiences. And of course, we have those, all the time, of course, is what I'm trying to point out. And of course, our beliefs very much shape our perceptions, but for the majority of us, it's not in a particularly kind of strong way, unless, of course, our beliefs are challenged. So if I challenge you on religion, for example, and what have you, religion is something that can be neither proved, not religion, but God and what God and the devil and blah blah blah, all that stuff. What it means is something that we can neither prove nor disprove. So what we rely on is our interpretations and our beliefs. And of course, we have so many different beliefs, varieties of beliefs about that topic, and so many different interpretations. Most of them geographically cultural. But because they're reinforced by community, you've experienced them in particular ways, and you feel the benefit of it. So if I challenge it, of course, that's what's happening, is you've accumulated this history with it, and you've learned a benefit from it. So of course, when that gets challenged, that's what you feel, coming up in you. But so that's why I say generally beliefs can actually sort of intensify experiences. They can also create experiences. So for example, if you have no qualms about people having premarital sex, for example, your experience of that news that someone is actually sleeping with a boyfriend before they got married doesn't bother you at all. So it's just an interesting thing about how our minds actually work. But it's important, that I highlight that for you, because as I say, what happens, of course, with voices is that it's the whole world of beliefs that changes quite radically. But and of course, what typically happens, with this kind of scenario, I live in a community in which I choose habitats. People behave within sort of normal ranges of kind of respect for each other generally. I can get this stuff to flow pretty naturally. I can actually, create a life in which it actually works very well for me. I mean, that's sort of the key point. I can find ways to have fun and do what I want to do. And of course, when that happens, it's like I get this reward progression. At every step along the way, the mind is actually recording. Each emotional system is taking a reading of my perception of community or the world that I live in, the habitat that I'm in, the stimuli I'm receiving, which leads to my kind of perception, which I then project forwards, in terms of how I think about it, and what I think about, what I'm going to do with it, how I'm going to express it, and of course then sort of feedback from the friends, family, the people I spend my day with. And that is the normal sort of progression. And the important piece here is that it actually is a progression, not just sequential, but it actually increases in value as you move across across this progression. If over here, if I'm receiving stimuli and I have this aha moment, gee, I can use this way, I can't wait to share it with whoever, my boss. I've got a great idea, and it gets me a promotion, for example, or a salary increase, or some recognition and appreciation even. Of course, that's an actual progression from a piece of information to which I've added value, and I've seen some sort of reward for it. Of course, this is how our reward system works. We're getting, as I say, ordinarily, we're getting the biggest bang for the buck over here. Out in the real world, we're expressing what we think and actually being appreciated for that. So appreciating and being appreciated is producing the highest reward signals. So of course, I may get some ups and downs on individual signals, but as long as I'm actually achieving some of what I want to achieve, and of course, it's appreciated by people around me, I'm able to see a pretty good progression. And of course, this is how I think, the majority of us actually experience life, is that, both in terms of, the transactions in the mind that are going on all day, and in how our life story, my story progresses. We're pretty much having, on the majority, good experiences, and we can see, a progression. We can see a future where, where this will actually continue. Now, of course, what happens, when you start to hear voices, is the same basic mechanism is there, and in fact, I'm still living, in this ordinary world. So, of course, this is what I'm, trying to do and achieve. Of course, what happens, when you start to hear voices, is I'm suddenly getting this extra layer of stimuli. The phenomenon, say, introduces these, weird stimuli, which I represent, of course, with the within the Jack in the Box. They bypass my filter. This is a very important piece of this. I don't have the usual filtering capability that I do for my ordinary stimuli. By their very nature, they're kind of scary. I experience them, you don't. They're arriving in the aware mind. They're out of context. They're not coming from my environment. They feel intrusive, and of course, then again, so what voices say, as I'm thinking about it, so instead of my normal sort of thinking process, I've now got this conversation with this other kind of entity, and I'm showing that as speech bubbles now instead of thinking, because that's what it's like. And of course, I'm showing it with these arrows pointing backwards, because actually what it's doing is it's getting in the way of my flow. Okay, so this would be, a good flow would literally lead to a healthy mind and a healthy body. This would be, the logic of psychoneuroimmunology, for example. Of course, what's happening here is, that actually voices are interfering and actually interrupting this ordinary flow, which is driven by chemistry. So this is what's happening. The actual stimuli are bypassing our filter and causing an alert, in typically either my SOO or my threat system, and kind of saying it's not matching a pattern, and or it's threatening, not matching what I want to achieve, and or I'm experiencing it as an actual threat. I'm literally experiencing it as getting in the way. It's slowing my sort of thought process down. It's not giving me an opportunity to follow through and actually understand what I want to do with it, how I'm going to express it with, and who I'm going to share it with. For me, actually, sharing stories of my hearing voices experience with my friends is a total waste of time. It's okay once or twice, but it's certainly not something I want to talk about with my friends every time we get together. It's not a shared experience. It's tough for them to understand, and of course, there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. So it's great, of course, that my friends and family are being very helpful when I get into the an extreme state, or into a state of kind of panic. But really, it's not the kind of thing that makes for dinner table conversation. This, of course, is actually part of the big problem with it. So of course, what happens is instead of actually being able to express it in the real world because it's irrelevant, completely irrelevant in the real world, we get into this relationship in our own mind with our mind and with ourselves, because they become objects that we observe as a result of how this thing prompts us, and we get into this relationship again in the mind with whatever character voices have asserted they are today. And then, of course, what they're also doing is from this vantage point, they're making all kinds of threats about the community and world that we live in. So, of course, I start to question this. And of course, as I'm suspicious about it, these weird perceptions and the weird context I'm in actually just serve to create beliefs in the powers of these voices in the world that I actually am living in. So, of course, what's happening here is, although we're interpreting it as an unsafe world that we're living in practice, it's actually a perception in the mind that we're experiencing as real because we're interacting with this unusual character. That has asserted this position of power, created the catch-22, and of course is now peppering us with all this information, mostly abusive and threatening, at a very, 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 very high volume of stimuli. Literally, I don't know, 100,000 a day. Comments from my voices on everything I think about, just about, okay? It certainly was at least at that level. Probably, I wouldn't be surprised if it was double that level for the first year. From nowadays, it's much, much less than that. But nevertheless, as I say, my brain is constantly searching, checking this frame of reference. So even when things go quiet, it doesn't take very long before, every time something gets my, if I'm sitting still, I'm watching TV for a while, for example, the moment something else gets my attention, if I decide to stand up and walk to the kitchen to get a glass of water, the moment I make that shift, my brain checks this other frame of reference to say it trains the brain so well. But what's happening is we're getting caught in the mind. We're experiencing it as very, very real, but actually it's all based, the experience that we're experiencing as real is based on the perceptions that this entity is able to create about the world around us and about ourselves, and of course about the relationship with this thing, because they've arrived, made themselves at home, been very aggressive, very abusive. So I experience them as malign. The intent clearly is. And of course, that leads me to ask questions about how secure is the world that I live in. And of course, because voices are actually trying to discourage me about the world, it pretty easily leads me to question and become suspicious of the world that I live in, and of course some particular characters in the world that I live in, which may be the relationships that are close to me underneath this square head here, and of course it may be particular, well, it may be people in the street that I perceive as giving me strange looks, of course, which I interpret in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways, or it may be the CIA in a conspiracy theory. The point I'm trying to make is that actually that stuff is all about perception. The real world hasn't changed. It's just that we're receiving so many, well, it isn't changing at any rate or any differently than it is for everybody else. But what's happening is, voices have trapped us in this catch-22 in the mind, where they're able to create this experience, which is abusive and threatening and malign. And of course, what that is leading us to do is to project that into the world around us. And of course, all we need is some kind of signal in some frame of reference in the world around us that matches that suspicion, and that then forms a belief. And of course, we then start to live in a world that we see as unsafe. Okay, so this is, so it's changing my perception and changing my concept of the world, because I now see the world as unsafe. So of course, what's happening is, of course, I'm still getting this reward progression, not only from me moving around, the world I'm in through the day, but because voices are shunting my frames of reference to, the community that I'm in, to individuals on the street, to my partner, to my friends, to, my family, to somebody, that I may be relying on or depending on for something, and trying to influence my perception of those individuals. Of course, what this thing is doing is actually changing. So both my perception, quite deliberately with the information that they throw at me and the signal strength with which my brain recognizes some of these signals. But of course, that signal strength also then, of course, translates when we project it, and of course, we start to see the world as an unfriendly place. So I'm still getting this reward progression, and of course, what's happening here is, voices are introducing a competing progression, and I'm taking it, from there through to here in the mind. And I'm saying what we're getting is, instead of positive signals, all of these are pretty much negative, because we're now seeing the world as unsafe. Voices are making threats. They're saying it won't happen. They're making it difficult. So they're undermining our Seuss system's ability, to see a good outcome. They're undermining my sense of agency, my ability to actually achieve a good outcome or achieve the outcomes that I want. And of course, they are sometimes literally, making threats that, this person is going to harm you in some way or another. And having made that suggestion and made you suspicious, it doesn't take much to actually make that experience of that actually quite scary, or at the very least unpleasant, or despairing or despondent. All those unpleasant emotions, which is why I've inverted this little graph of measuring the quality of our signals. And of course, the other thing is that actually you might have noticed that this one over here is absent. So the one where I would ordinarily be getting the strongest signals from my interactions with people during the day, that one is for many of us almost entirely absent sometimes, because we become isolated. Because voices have badgered us to that sort of point where we don't have the confidence to go out in the world in the kind of in the ordinary way. And of course, when we do, we're getting so many of these negative signals that actually are ordinary positive signals that we would get from our normal day-to-day activity have been displaced, because voices have asserted those these signals derived via them and the phenomenology. They've distorted their significance, both what's the word I'm looking for? Both automatically in the way that the brain is actually responding, because the brain is recording all of these signals. My brain is adjusting, and you've seen that in the sort of phenomenology videos, that sort of triangle that I'm talking about of how the brain is prepared. That's the hypervigilance factor, for example. And then, of course, from the mind point of view, just by what voices say, what they suggest, how they create suspicions, how they claim, things that will happen, their aggressive language, their predictive language, some of which we don't even recognize at the time. And what they're doing is they are displacing our normal, most powerful reward signals, with signals that are coming from this experience. And of course, what we see is this progression, which is on a downward trend, and of course, individually, not very pleasant. And of course, what that does is it makes our perception of self, of the world, of the day, all rather unpleasant. So of course, what's happened to say here is that by making our perceptions real, voices have, what's going on under the hood is that our reward system has been completely knocked off kilter. And of course, our brain is recording all these transactions of all stimuli, both from the real world and from this phenomenon. And of course, the phenomenon, the stimuli that originate from this phenomenon have stolen mind share, they've stolen significance. They're at an incredibly high volume. So of course, they are very much getting in the way of our normal day-to-day living, and of course, the way that we appreciate the world, the way we see the world. So to kind of summarize that then in terms of what this sort of translates to in terms of outcomes, in terms of how, for example, if you were a psychiatrist, say this might be a good way for you to kind of describe to someone, what's actually going on, is number one, is that there is this transactional problem. And you've seen this kind of slide before, is that actually what's happening is the phenomenology is inserting in our process of our processing of information. It's presenting a stimuli with its own context or without a context. It's engaging the brain, if you like, and our processor in a reaction response cycle in which we interpret what's going on, we assess the implications, and of course, some of those lead to these sort of episodes that bubble over. So these are the extreme states that add up to our lived experience. So this kind of piece here is not something that's that people who don't hear voices typically experience. I mean, some might get a few, but certainly not as extreme, of course, as you do kind of if you hear voices. And I say this is this other thing, so that it's created this sort of unusual relationships, one with yourself, one with other characters, and because the characters are experienced as this two-way transmission of thought voice, it brings your attention to your thoughts in a way that's I can only tell you that that's what's happening. To describe that to you, what it's doing is it's making me incredibly aware of my thoughts, and of course, as I think about something, voices are commenting on it and exaggerating that awareness of my thoughts. So for most of us, thinking is a fairly neutral thing. And of course, what happens is I say that thinking becomes a scary experience. And of course, because this whole thing is very much, say, in the mind, we get these thinking episodes that are scary. And of course, if they're that bad, if they've engaged the threat system, we're inclined to act on them. And of course, that's the stuff that I say sometimes spills over into panic attacks and whatever goes with them. So this is the at the sort of transactional level. At the story level, I pointed out in the part 3 video that there were these two themes I sort of spoke about. The one was stuff that was unique to me. So this related to what I was trying to do. So from the previous slide, you could see that the hearing voices experience is kind of displacing what I was trying to do with my life. So for me, the things that I identified here are the points at which I actually made progress in terms of what I was trying to do as a result of voices. For the majority of people, they either, they may actually be out of work, which, for example, especially if you're a young person, most young people are looking for work, they're trying to fulfill their dreams, in some ways. So of course, they don't have those usual stimuli that actually produce a proper reward progression. Things I'm doing today that will yield benefit tomorrow and the next day and the day after, building my strength, my capability, my skills. In this kind of space, we're talking to people about building their resilience and their coping skills, as opposed to skills in life in terms of creating my story. And that, to me, is such a sad thing about this experience. And then, of course, the other thing I spoke about was that actually, as this stuff endures, we go through this kind of cycle, as I say, some of which can become, real lows. Or we go through the stage of confusion, of struggling to find help, of these episodes that kind of spill over and start to damage my story. This feeling of helplessness because I don't know what to do about it, and getting help is difficult. And then realizing that this is chronic, it's not going away. That the voices might go away for a little bit, but they're going to come back and attack me. And of course, that's going to lead to another one of these that's going to get me in hospital. So that's the paranoia. Some fears about the phenomenology itself, because voices apply phenomenology as torture. They make threats and impose them of pain, of just pestering you all day, of keeping you awake, all these kind of things. And in the end, you kind of start to say, well, there are no good outcomes from this kind of thing. And then you're going to get, I got angry because that's just was the response it provoked in me. But of course, I think a lot of people are going to get sad and despondent and just have this sort of feeling of despair. So that's the whole thing. To say the other way to kind of look at this is that actually what this is doing is undermining our quality of life. And actually, the way to look at that is, in addition to the previous two slides, which was the flow of information and how that produces emotions and kind of reward signals. The other way to look at it is to kind of say, on that same scale, what is the quality of our experiences on a moment-by-moment basis? How do they progress? And say we can split that into two themes. The one is how am I interpreting this in my story? So what's actually happening to my frames of reference. The other one is our emotional systems are predictive as well, because of this progression and our predictive mind. And of course, if we're achieving good reward signals, consistently or regularly, we develop a sense of optimism, confidence, and a security. Excuse me. And of course, if this is the situation that you live with, our emotional systems are not achieving what they've evolved into. So we're developing a dim view of the world, and we're experiencing it in, as I say, in an unpleasant way. So that was just, for me, a good way to kind of summarize, the previous three experience videos, and bring the emphasis back to the process, which is the reward mechanism and progression, and point out actually, we've seen now how structurally this phenomenon plus the stories they create plus how they provoke the mind set up this position that perpetuates fear and paranoia. So later on I'll show you how to address that, because actually there isn't a sensible path out of it. You've got to face it head on and have sort of confidence in the world around you and people around you to make it easy to do that. And I'll talk about that, kind of in the mind strategies. And then also in the mind strategies, I'll talk to you about how to use this in a mindful response to actually build up your emotional, to produce the right emotional signals in the transaction. And of course, that then will help you translate this into the story that you're building in. So once again, a very quick one here, just the kind of thing, learning from this thing, is that actually, all of our problems flow from the phenomenon. So I've shown here, how the phenomenon creates the experience, how the experience undermines our reward system. And of course, once our reward system is undermined, we have poor outcomes, of course, in the mind and actually in life. And actually, there's a very logical flow from the nature of the phenomenology that individuals are experiencing, which I represent by this. And of course, I'm hoping now that you will actually see that the problems all flow from that. So, the mania, the paranoia, the racing thoughts, isolation, pretty much every symptom, if you like, that's been identified, can be explained, of course, in this way. So, of course, what we need to do is act to minimize the impacts of the phenomenon. And I'm actually using the word phenomenon here as opposed to phenomenology. So if the phenomenology is the special effects, we need to discover what it is that's producing all these special effects, and that's why I'm calling it a phenomenon. I'm hoping that you will also have seen by now that clearly a chemical imbalance is not going to describe the complexity of these stimuli. And it's pretty logical from this, that all the other problems we see actually derive from the stimuli, that our mind is actually working as it should. It's the stimuli that are unusual, and we need to be focusing our attention on identifying what this thing is and where these stimuli are coming from. And in the meantime, in chapter 7, I've done just the introduction slide on the mind strategies, at least as of today, and I'll be adding to those from next week. So thank you for watching this video. Once again, I would like to keep as much of this material free for people who hear voices. If you can help me do that, I have this fundraiser called Someone You Know Hears Voices on crowdrise.com. If you'd like to comment on social media, please use #MadSense. And of course, if you're a researcher or group of service professionals who would like to do some work together, you can reach me at greg@mad-sense.com. And as in all my other videos, there are these other players in the field doing good work, most of them operating on donations. So please help if you can. We would all very much appreciate it. So thank you.